Speaker Ryan, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Less than an hour ago, the White House announced the expulsion of 60 Russian diplomats, the shuttering of the Russian consulate in Seattle, and this is all in response to the nerve agent poisoning of Sergei Skripal, a Russian ex-spy in Britain. And also around an hour ago, the EU announced that 14 member states were also expelling more than 24 Russian diplomats. Now, given the fact that the British investigation into this poisoning is still ongoing, do you think that it is premature maybe to start kicking out Russian diplomats?
I don't. I think it was the right call. I think it was, this is done in solidarity with our allies in Britain. I think it's fantastic that other European nations, including the Czech Republic right here, followed suit as well. And I think it was an entirely appropriate action to take.
There was a Russian murder case in the 1990s in which a scientist admitted that a military-grade poison had been sold onto the black market and used in the killing of a businessman.
I think the evidence is fairly clear in this particular case, and I think the British had made their case pretty clear. And this is something that Russia has been doing. And this is something that we think that Russia has done. This should not be tolerated. This is not something that civil nations do. And so I think it's an entirely appropriate response and done in solidarity with our great allies in Great Britain. And I'm pleased to see other European nations join suit.
It's also an escalation. The Kremlin has already vowed to respond in kind.
Escalate, I guess the question is who got
diplomatic
this started. Sure, it's a diplomatic explanation, but that's why something like this should not be tolerated. Poisoning and killing people, especially with a nerve agent like this, poisoning and killing people on the soil of other countries is something that civil nations do not do, should not do, and that's why it should not be tolerated.
You said recently that you are for ratcheting up sanctions on Russia.
I am.
Do you have specific new measures that you would like to see?
Well, I think the sanctions should target the financial controls of whether it's oligarchs or extensions of the Kremlin because of this disinformation that is occurring in all of our democracies. I think Russia is trying to seed chaos into democracies around the world. I think they're trying to undermine democracies. We know without a shred of doubt that they try to meddle in our elections in the United States. We also know that they're trying to meddle with elections around the world with different democracies. So it's incumbent upon us to not only uncover this, but to uncover their methods and sources for how they try to sow chaos and try to undermine democracy and fair and free elections, and then give our allies the tools they need to prevent it from happening again, and also to make sure that there are consequences that come to bear when you try to undermine democracies like Russia has been doing. So Russia does do this. Russia has been doing this. They're continuing to do it. It is something that cannot and should not be tolerated by Western democracies. And so that's why it's important for us to call Russia on it. And I think we should target more sanctions to Russians, to the financing mechanism, and to these kinds of activities.
But if Russia is just continuing these activities that you're talking about,
so we should probably.
Well, I'm just wanting our sanctions and actually an effective policy tool.
I think they typically are. I think with the Magnitsky and others, I think sanctions have borne fruit. I think sanctions. First of all, you must have consequences for such undemocratic actions. I think for the West to simply take it and just accept that some other country try and undermine your democracy, meddle in your internal affairs, would just be wrong to begin with. The question as to whether or not sanctions are effective enough, I think that's just really a matter of time and the potency of those sanctions.
Mm-hmm. I mean, for example, the Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny has said he does not support Western sanctions on the broader Russian economy because it hurts everyday Russians. And he proposes that Western sanctions should focus more on people close to Putin.
I think that's a very legitimate argument. I think the question is where does the money go and how is it being used? And that's why it's not always easy to have sanctions that can be surgical like you would like them to be.
Mm-hmm. Both Washington and Russia are seeking the extradition of a suspected Russian hacker who's in custody here in the Czech Republic. His name is Yevgeny Nikulin. He's accused of a massive breach of U.S. companies, including LinkedIn. And the decision to extradite him is now, or where to extradite him, is now in the hands of the Czech Justice Minister. He has said that President Zeman wants this suspected hacker handed over to Russia. Will you raise this issue with officials here in Prague? And what's your case for why he should be handed over to the United States?
Of course I'll raise this issue. It is a high priority of our government, and it's simply because we want to respect the rule of law, and we have every bit of confidence that the Czech government will respect the rule of law. Their extradition laws are very clear. The case is very clear. They're going through the judicial process, and I have every bit of confidence that the rule of law will be respected. The case for extraditing him to America versus Russia is extremely clear in just about every way you can measure the case. So this is something that civil societies and democracies do. They respect each other's laws. They respect the process and the procedures. He did violate our laws. He did hack these companies, as you say. So the extradition claim is very legitimate. And I just expect that the Czech system will go through its process. And at the end of that process, I'm hopeful and expecting that he'll be extradited.
You also said recently that you'd received assurances that there were no plans to fire Robert Mueller. But given President Trump's criticism of his Russia probe, do you think legislation is needed to protect the investigation?
I don't think so, because I don't think, like I said before, he's going to be fired. Like I said, I've received assurances that that's not going to be the case. But the point I made in my press conference last week is it's very important for people to know that we believe that the rule of law is a sacred principle, and that we have a justice system in our country based upon that bedrock foundational premise of respect for the rule of law, and that no one, a president or anybody, is above that principle, is above the law. So that is a sacrosanct principle for us. That's a point I keep making, and that is why I believe they're not even considering firing him at this time, and I don't think they ever will. And it's important that this investigation be allowed to carry its full course.
Well, what would the downside be of legislation if it doesn't trigger anything?
Well,
unless he's fired?
I don't believe it's necessary, and I don't think there really is you get into constitutional issues with respect to the powers of the executive branch versus powers of the legislative branch. I won't go into that debate, other than to say we must respect the rule of law. He should be allowed to do his job, and I have absolutely no reason to believe they're even considering firing him.
President Trump has drawn harsh criticism from both sides of the aisle about his decision to call Vladimir Putin and congratulate him on his recent re-election. You said previously that the Obama administration was, I quote, chronically naive about Russia. Yeah. Do you think the Trump administration has been, as you put it, less naive?
I think they have been less naive. I think the sanctions are proof of that. I don't think we should have canceled missile defense. I don't think the reset strategy worked. I think it was a naive strategy. I think Russia poses a great geopolitical threat, not just to America, but to the West and to free people and to free countries and to democracy itself. And I think it's important for us to see it for what it is and respond accordingly.
Final question. President Trump signed into law a government funding bill that unexpectedly included financial restrictions and other measures targeting Russia. It was unclear exactly who inserted that language into the bill. Can you shed any light on that?
No, it went through all the committee process. We've been pushing this bill since last September. So this is legislation that was written by our various appropriation committees. All of this language has gone through the legislative process, and it was just a culmination of basically a year's worth of work.
Mr. Speaker, thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, nice to meet you. Pleasure.